In the shadowed halls of Japan's Imperial Navy, age-old doctrines clashed with the roar of the modern aircraft. Battleships, once the pride of the fleet, were now vulnerable to unseen enemies from the sky. Admirals whispered in disbelief, questioning decades of strategy as entire fleets vanished under waves of bombs and torpedoes. The great Yamato, steel leviathan of the Pacific, became a symbol not of invincibility, but of hubris. This is the story of men, machines, and the brutal truth that warfare had changed forever. Steel gleamed under the rising sun, the hulls of Japan's capital ships cutting through the morning mist like knives through silk. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the pride of an island nation whose very identity was entwined with the sea, had spent decades crafting symbols of national might, battleships. These floating fortresses were more than instruments of war. They were monuments to ambition, to honor, to the very idea of invincibility. Officers in crisp uniforms strode across steel decks, inspecting gun turrets that could hurl shells heavier than a man over miles of ocean. Each rivet, each polished rail, whispered of a culture that revered discipline and perfection above all else. The world outside Japan had tried to contain this ambition. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had imposed strict limits on tonnage and armament, a measure meant to prevent a new arms race after the Great War. For Japanese naval planners, it became a challenge, a puzzle of engineering and ingenuity. Every ship designed under these constraints had to be a masterpiece, a testament to Japanese ingenuity and the spirit of Bushido, the warrior code that shaped both sailors and strategists alike. The answer came in the Yamato-class battleships, colossal leviathans that dwarfed every other ship afloat, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns capable of leveling enemy fleets. Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi, were not merely ships. They were statements, floating declarations that Japan would never be second on the seas. Admirals Isoroku Yamamoto and Asami Nagano walked these decks with reverence, understanding the power at their fingertips. Yet even as they championed steel and firepower, a quiet unease lingered in the corners of their minds. Aircraft carriers were still regarded with suspicion, their potential underestimated, their influence only hinted at in intelligence reports and wargame simulations. The battleship remained king, its roar unmatched, its presence undeniable, but the wind was shifting, and the horizon carried the faint hum of engines that could render all this steel obsolete. Ceremonial inspections, the rhythmic beat of drills and the smell of gun oil and sea salt filled the air, a ritual affirming both discipline and pride. Men trained, guns were polished, and the Yamato herself seemed to breathe with anticipation, a steel leviathan poised for glory. Yet beneath the confidence, a subtle tension vibrated along the decks, a whisper in the corridors. The sky had begun to whisper a different story. Above the vast Pacific, a new power was taking shape, one that moved silently, swiftly, and invisibly aircraft carriers. For decades, the battleship had been the unquestioned sovereign of the seas, a floating fortress whose guns dictated the outcome of wars before they began. Yet, in the early 1930s, intelligence reports and experimental wargames began to hint at a growing threat. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers, launched from decks that moved faster than any port could contain, could strike from miles away, bypassing armor that had once been invincible. Every report of an aircraft carrier exercise, every intercepted radio transmission, began to sow unease among the halls of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood this transformation better than most. A seasoned strategist, he saw in aircraft carriers the future of naval warfare, ships that could project power across hundreds of miles, striking the enemy before they ever fired a gun. Yamamoto's vision was revolutionary, almost heretical. The steel leviathans he had revered, the Yamato-class battleships, were vulnerable. Their immense guns could not reach the sky, and no amount of armor could withstand a coordinated air assault. He pressed for carrier expansion, for the creation of powerful air wings. each equipped with Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, HID-3A dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, capable of sorties exceeding 200 miles from their mother ships. But within the naval high command, resistance ran deep. Senior admirals, steeped in tradition, clung to doctrines that had ruled the seas for decades. Battleships were honor, carriers were auxiliary, untested, a risk to prestige. Meetings in Tokyo were tense, debates fractious, as Yamamoto's warnings collided with pride and entrenched belief. The idea that the future lay not in armor and tonnage but in speed, maneuverability, and aerial reach was uncomfortable, almost threatening. The tension between tradition and innovation was laid bare in 1941. At Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's vision reached its apex. Carriers launched waves of aircraft with precision and ruthlessness, sinking battleships that had seemed untouchable, demonstrating the tactical genius of naval aviation. Yet even in victory, the gamble carried enormous risk. Carriers were fewer, more fragile, and their loss could unravel the empire's ambitions in an instant. The ocean's rulers, steel giants that had ruled with certainty for generations, would soon face a reckoning from above. The sky, long ignored, had become the arbiter of naval supremacy, and the era of the battleship, however glorious, was quietly, inexorably drawing to an end. June 4, 1942. The Pacific sky burned with the first light of dawn, yet for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the horizon promised neither warmth nor hope. Over 1,000 miles north of Hawaii, the waters around Midway Atoll became the stage for a confrontation that would forever redefine naval warfare. The Japanese plan was audacious: lure the U.S. fleet into a trap, destroy the carriers, and secure dominance across the Pacific. At the center of the strategy were the same steel leviathans that had symbolized invincibility, battleships like Yamato's sisters, and the fleet's formidable carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu. Yet the ocean itself would expose vulnerabilities that no armor could conceal. U.S. Navy intelligence had cracked Japanese communication codes, revealing the attack plan in detail. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz positioned Task Forces 16 and 17 with surgical precision, preparing to exploit the overconfidence of his opponent. By mid-morning, Japanese pilots launched strikes, and for a fleeting moment, the battle seemed to follow familiar doctrines. Dive bombers, however, approached from altitudes and angles the Japanese had scarcely anticipated. Swooping in with terrifying accuracy, Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft from USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown transformed the ocean into a tableau of fire and steel. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were struck in quick succession, each detonation tearing through magazines and decks, sending columns of smoke skyward that could be seen for miles. Onboard Japanese flagships, shock and disbelief rippled through the command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had championed the integration of air power years earlier, watched with a grim realization. Even his careful planning could not shield the fleet from human error, timing mishaps, and the unpredictability of war. Admiral Asami Nagano, long an advocate for battleship supremacy, faced the bitter knowledge that doctrine alone could not secure victory. Torpedo bombers and dive planes had exploited miscalculations, delays in fighter cover, poorly coordinated attacks, and underestimation of U.S. carrier placement. The sensory chaos was unimaginable. Explosions reverberated across the waves, decks splintered into firestorms, and oil-slicked waters reflected the orange glow of burning ships. Sailors fought amid smoke and fire, trying to salvage guns, rescue comrades, and maintain a semblance of order as each successive strike shredded the illusion of invulnerability. By nightfall, 4 carriers were lost, over 3,000 men dead or missing, and the mighty battleship force was forced into retreat. The tide had turned not with a single decisive duel of guns, but with the precise coordination of air power and intelligence, a new age of naval warfare written in smoke and fire. The psychological impact was profound. Hubris shattered, confidence eroded. The Japanese Navy had been humbled and the stark truth crystallized. Dominance at sea no longer belonged solely to steel titans. If Midway was a warning, it was one they could not ignore or survive. In the months following Midway, the steel leviathans of the Imperial Japanese Navy were no longer symbols of invincibility. They were reminders of human limitation. Yamato and Musashi, the pride of the fleet and the apex of battleship engineering, sat in harbors and forward bases like sleeping giants, their immense hulls gleaming under the sun yet weighed down by an invisible burden, obsolescence. Admirals who had once strode across their decks with pride now confronted the harsh truth that armor and artillery could no longer guarantee supremacy. Within the naval high command, debates grew bitter and unrelenting. Strategy meetings in Tokyo were filled with tension as officers argued over the allocation of resources. Some still clung to the doctrine that battleships would decide wars at sea, citing tonnage, armor, and gunnery superiority. Others, following Yamamoto's earlier warnings, pushed for the rapid expansion of carrier forces, emphasizing air wings and long-range strike capabilities. Yet bureaucracy and tradition slowed every decision. One recorded remark captured the mood of many. Our steel giants are becoming floating coffins. It was not bravado or fear-mongering. It was a sober acknowledgement that the tools of yesterday were ill-suited for the battles of tomorrow. Operational realities compounded the psychological strain. Yamato and Musashi required enormous logistical support, fuel, ammunition, maintenance, and trained crews. Each sortie or patrol became a massive undertaking, stretching supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean. Their immense size, once celebrated, now made them vulnerable targets. Even at anchor, their presence attracted enemy reconnaissance, and their slow maneuverability limited tactical flexibility. Dive bombers and torpedo planes could strike with impunity, forcing admirals to weigh each engagement with a grim calculus. How many men could be risked, how much steel could be expended, and whether victory was even possible. Morale, too, was under siege. Sailors who had revered these vessels now navigated corridors of cold steel with a quiet resignation, aware that survival depended less on armor than on the fortune of timing and circumstance. Officers debated strategy with a mix of pride, fear, and desperation, knowing that any mistake could cascade into disaster. Explosions and fires in distant campaigns haunted their discussions, the sensory memory of shattered decks and sinking hulls lingering like ghosts. The clash between human attachment to tradition and the ruthless logic of technological change created an unbearable tension. Battleships, the ultimate instruments of honor and power, were no longer the arbiters of the seas. Even as Yamato's massive guns gleamed and Musashi's decks were polished to ceremonial perfection, the fleet understood a new reality. Even the mightiest steel could not defy the sky. Air power had claimed supremacy, and the age of the battleship, once eternal in ambition, now teetered on the edge of irrelevance. April 7, 1945. The sea around the Ryukyu Islands was calm, but the calm belied the storm to come. Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, steamed southward on her final mission, Operation Tengo. She was to reach Okinawa, provide artillery support, and if necessary, fight to the last man. No escorting carriers, no air cover. Only her steel, her guns, and her 3,332 crew stood between her and the overwhelming power of the U.S. Navy. What had once been the apex of naval supremacy now lumbered forward into an ocean dominated by aircraft. From the first light of dawn, American reconnaissance aircraft had tracked Yamato's progress. Soon, waves of carrier-based planes from Task Force 58 converged. Over 300 aircraft, Grumman F-6F Hellcats, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo planes, descended upon the fleet with surgical precision. Dive bombers peeled away from the clouds, releasing 1,000-pound bombs that splintered decks and ignited secondary explosions. Torpedo planes circled low, striking at the hull with relentless accuracy. Yamato, for all her size and armor, could not evade. Her guns roared defiantly, returning fire where possible, but the sky itself had become an impenetrable wall of steel and fire. On board, the crew confronted terror and duty in equal measure. Sailors fired what guns remained operational, fought fires raging across decks, and attempted to man stations even as the battleship listed from successive hits. Explosions shattered bulkheads, hurling men and equipment into the sea. Smoke and flames coiled like serpents over the steel, and each impact sent shudders through the decks. Casualties mounted rapidly. Nearly 3,000 lives lost in hours, a grim testament to both courage and the futility of the mission. Admirals observing the unfolding catastrophe were forced into bitter reflection. The pride once vested in Yamato, the ultimate expression of Japanese naval might, had become a symbol of obsolescence. Isoroku Yamamoto's earlier warnings about air power and the vulnerability of battleships had been vindicated in the most devastating way. Asami Nagano and other senior officers had long resisted change, clinging to steel and tradition. Now, the culmination of that resistance lay broken in the Pacific, a cautionary monument to strategic miscalculation. By mid-afternoon, Yamato capsized and sank, a colossal mass disappearing beneath the waves. Smoke plumed skyward, and oil slicks shimmered with the reflection of a dying era. The final salvo of her guns and the heroism of her crew would be remembered, but the age of battleships had ended definitively. The lessons of Yamato, innovation outpacing tradition, the supremacy of air power, and the human cost of rigid doctrine, would resonate long after the wreck rested on the ocean floor. The last battleship was gone, but the lessons would linger. The war ended, but the echoes of steel and fire lingered across the Pacific. Battleships that had once embodied national pride and military dominance now lay in harbors, scarred and silent, or rested on the ocean floor, monuments to an era that had ended not with a triumphant salvo, but with the quiet inevitability of technological evolution. The Imperial Japanese Navy, humbled by defeat, confronted the stark reality that the age of the battleship had passed. Strategy, once rooted in tonnage, armor, and gunnery, had been eclipsed by speed, maneuverability, and the reach of aircraft. Carriers, submarines, and combined arms had rewritten the rules of naval engagement, leaving steel leviathans as relics in a transformed world. Post-war analysis was unflinching. Military historians and surviving admirals traced the arc from Yamato's construction to her final descent beneath the waves, noting that pride and tradition had clashed with the cold arithmetic of war. The Japanese Navy had invested billions in ships designed for a doctrine that no longer applied. Lessons were drawn with precision. Air power could dominate even the most formidable surface fleets. Intelligence and timing were as decisive as firepower, and human error, the misjudgment of ranges, underestimation of enemy capability, could render any weapon irrelevant. For Japan, the implications were profound. Naval planning shifted toward submarines, carriers, and smaller, more flexible vessels capable of both offense and reconnaissance. The obsessive focus on battleships was replaced with a pragmatic embrace of technology and adaptability. The human dimension of these lessons cannot be understated. Admirals who had once walked proud decks, feeling invincible atop steel giants, were forced to reckon with the limits of doctrine and hubris. Sailors who had poured their lives into the maintenance of guns and hulls witnessed, in action and aftermath, how human pride could be both a motivator and a liability. Across the world, navies took note. The greatest weapon is irrelevant if it cannot adapt to the changing face of war. Strategic foresight, integration of new technology, and the humility to discard tradition when obsolete became cornerstones of modern naval doctrine. And yet, there remains the poetic weight of what was lost. Empty decks, rusting steel, and silent harbors speak of ambition and sacrifice, of dreams and miscalculations intertwined. The Pacific, once shattered by gunfire and flame, now reflects only the sky, a mirror to the impermanence of human endeavor. Yamato, Musashi, and their sister ships rest beneath the waves, but the story they tell, the collision of pride, technology, and inevitability, lingers, a reminder that even the mightiest instruments of war are subject to forces beyond human control. The ocean holds their memory in steel and smoke, a cinematic testament to the enduring truth. In war, as in life, innovation will always challenge tradition, and human error will always leave its mark.